Hi everyone, I'm Claire, and I can't even tell you how thrilled I am to be here today. I first actually heard about Big Omaha maybe a couple years ago when I stumbled across a talk by Scott Harrison of Charity Water, if any of you are familiar with him and his work and his organization. And if any of you have watched the talk, I highly recommend it, but it struck me and it moved me so deeply. I've donated money, I gave up my birthday for Charity Water this past year like a lot of people have done, but I bring it up only because I think it really speaks to the power of this event. I think it's incredible the reach that Big Omaha has and the platform that it gives for people to be able to share a message. So I'm just completely humbled to be here and to be on this stage in front of you guys. So as David was saying, my name's Claire. I run a software company. I'm the CEO of a software company called Know Your Company. And we're a software tool that helps CEOs get to know their employees better. We work specifically with companies with about 25 to 75 employees, and it's when a CEO has started to hire a lot of people, they really deeply care about their employees, but for some reason feel like they just don't have their finger on the pulse of their company as well as they'd like to. And we've been lucky enough to work with CEOs and companies such as Airbnb, Kickstarter, Medium, Techstars, Jellyvision. We work with companies in over 15 different countries all over the world. The product itself was actually originally built by a company called Basecamp, formerly known as 37 Signals. So they actually built the product for themselves internally, launched it to the public, and then a little over a year ago, because it was so successful and gained so much traction, they decided to spin it out as its own separate company and asked me to run it as the CEO. So that's why I'm standing in front of all of you here today. The question, though, that I would like to ask all of you is this. When's the last time you wanted to say something at work, but for some reason or another, just felt like you couldn't? Maybe you were thinking, oh wow, we're moving way too slow on this project, but you decided not to say anything. Maybe you were thinking, wow, we're just growing way too fast as a company, but you know what, I'm not gonna bring that up. Or maybe you're feeling, you know what, the vision in the company is unclear, but yeah, nothing about that's really gonna change, so I'm just not gonna say anything. Or perhaps you're a manager and you're managing an employee and you've noticed their work is becoming really scattered. You don't wanna damage their morale, so you know what, just better to not say anything at all. It's interesting, there are so many things that we observe in a company, that we think to ourselves about what could be better. And for some reason, all these things we often don't say. I call these things the things unsaid. And I really believe it's these things unsaid in a company, the things that we think in our heads but don't say out loud. These are the things that actually hurt your company the most. When you notice that, hey, the vision's unclear, and yet that doesn't get vocalized until later down the line, when you notice that one of your employees, really should be picking up the slack, but you don't say anything until it's too late and they end up leaving the company, these are the things that bubble up slowly over time and only get worse. So it's these things that are unsaid that hurt a company the most. And because of that, getting feedback is really the most important thing you can be doing in your company, whether you're a CEO, whether you're a manager, or whether you're an employee. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about these things unsaid. I'm going to talk about, why is it that for some reason it's really difficult to vocalize certain things in a company? How often does this really happen? What's the cost of this financially to a company? And then most importantly, I'm going to talk about what each of you can do about it. and how in your own companies it's possible to create an environment where even the most introverted person can feel comfortable bringing up concerns, suggestions, and ideas. So, first of all, though, I want to give you a little bit of background as to why I care so much about this problem to begin with. It's, a pain that I felt personally firsthand. So before I was the CEO of Know Your Company, I was an employee at an early stage e-commerce startup. They had a team of about 6 people, and I really, enjoyed working there, and it was interesting. One of the things that I remember at the time when I was just an employee, the CEO would ask me from time to time, is he would ask me this. He would say, "Claire, how's it going?" And I'd think, things are going fine. And perhaps, you've had your manager or you as a manager have asked this to your employees. The interesting thing about this is when my CEO would ask me this, things were not fine at all. All those things that I showed you on the previous slides of the things that we don't say, the observations I'd had in the company, different ideas, suggestions, for some reason I didn't feel comfortable voicing them, and it honestly made me deeply unhappy. So unhappy that I ended up quitting my job after a little over a year and went to go start my own consulting practice, which later then is what brought me to become the CEO of Know Your Company. But it's this pain of these things unsaid. This is what really drives people to leave their jobs. It's what drives a lot of the problems that happen in a company. And it wasn't just me. It's something that happens all the time. So studies have shown that 85% of employees have admitted to feeling unable to voice their concerns. 70% of employees have actually hesitated about bringing up their concerns, and 42% of employees have admitted to withholding information about routine problems and things they've seen in the company. So actually withholding information. So it's something, these things that are unsaid, the things we keep and don't say, it's something that happens all the time. And it ends up costing the company a lot of money. There are some real direct costs that happen because of this. One of the biggest is, as you might have guessed, disengagement. So feedback and the lack of feedback is directly linked to employee disengagement. It's found that managers who don't give a lot of feedback, they actually make employees, 4 out of 10 employees, actively disengage. And as I'm sure you know, we're all well aware of the statistics of how for each disengaged employee that you have in a company, it's costing anywhere between $3,000 and $400 up to $10,000 per employee, right? And this doesn't even account for a lot of the intangible costs that come from someone who's disengaged in your company. On top of that, there's turnover, and so if you have an employee who's disengaged, maybe they're going to end up leaving the company. There's a really well-known statistic about how today 74% of employees in your company are actually considering leaving their job, 74%. And why is that? Most recently, a couple months ago actually, this is a very recent study that Gallup did, is they interviewed 7,200 employees, asked them why they left their jobs. Half of them said it was to get away from their manager. And why did they want to get away from their manager? Well, they found out that more than half of workers who agreed to this statement, "I feel that I can approach my manager with any type of questions," those were the employees who were actively engaged. And so it's the employees who feel as though they can come to someone with an idea that they have, a suggestion they have. It's an employee who feels like they can talk about the things unsaid. Those are the ones who are actually going to stay at your company. And because the downside is if someone leaves, look how much it's costing. It's 1.5 times an employee's salary to actually replace someone. And of course, naturally, some employees are going to leave and you can't help it, and maybe it might have been good that they did. But for the ones where you really can't afford to lose, you've got to be thinking, okay, helping them talk about the things unsaid, that's going to be the real key to them staying at my company. And then the third cost of, the things unsaid are the accidents and the mistakes that have happened. This statistic in particular surprised me. So a study that was done across several industries found that employees only directly intervene in about 2 out of 5 unsafe actions and conditions that they observe in the workplace. So there are real mistakes and accidents that happen because there are things that go unsaid and that go unspoken. So why does this happen? If we've all done it, if if we all have seen and observed the costs, why don't we just say what we think at work? Why doesn't that happen? Well, there are two reasons. The first, as I'm sure you might have guessed, is fear. So naturally, in a company, when you have an employee and an employer, there's a completely natural power dynamic at play. It's just by nature of the relationship, the fact that there's someone who's paying another person for a certain outcome. So because of that, there's no real incentive for an employee to say anything that might disrupt that dynamic. There's an element of fear, and not just fear of, oh, maybe I'll get fired, but a fear of even, maybe I'll get seen in a different way. Maybe I'll get treated by my coworkers in a different way. Maybe, my opinion won't be respected. Maybe I'll get passed up for a promotion. But that fear is very much real. The second reason for why people don't speak up at work, though, this one is even greater than fear, and that's futility. So it's the feeling that even if I were to speak up and say, here's my suggestion, here's what I think could be better in the company, it's feeling as though nothing would change. And it's this feeling of futility. It's found that studies have shown it's 1.8 times more powerful as an obstacle to feedback than fear. So it's the fact that people feel like, you know what, even if I say something, my feedback isn't going to get implemented, so what's the use? So it really goes to reinforce the point that the reason why people have ideas, suggestions, and feedback in the first place is because they want people to act on it. So fear and futility, these are the two obstacles to why we don't speak up at work. They're the two reasons fueling, why there are so many things unspoken in a company. So the big question then is, how do we overcome that? How do we uncover the things that are unsaid in a company? How do we create an environment where people feel willing, open, and honest in how they communicate? How do you do that? Well, there are three things that I want to share with you today. Three things that each of you can do. Again, whether you're an employee, a manager, or a business owner, these are things that you can do starting on Monday. And the first thing that you can do to help create that open and honest environment, to help uncover the things unsaid, is that you can go first. So what I mean by going first is as an employee, as a manager, as a leader, is to show a little bit of vulnerability. Understand that people aren't just going to come to you with, what they might think could be better, but people are a lot more willing to do that if you're able to go first. So one way you could do that is to say, I could use your advice about something. Advice, very different from saying, I would really like to get your feedback about something, right? People, when you ask for advice, it's something that, people are always willing to give. They're always willing to give advice. Another thing that you can do is to admit a vulnerability. So to say to someone, you know what, I'm struggling with trying to figure out, the best way to run our board meetings. Would you happen to have any ideas about that? Right? So all of a sudden, instead of saying, you know what, we need to come up with a better way to run our board meetings, but it's admitting a vulnerability, going first, showing someone that you're welcoming them to being open to feedback. So that's the first thing that you can do, is you can go first. The second thing that you can do is you can ask specific questions. Sounds easy enough, pretty obvious, right? Well, it's funny how difficult it actually is, right? So asking questions, okay, if I want answers, I've got to ask questions. But specific questions, this is a little more difficult, because how often have you found yourself, whether you're having a one-on-one with an employee and you've asked, yeah, how's it going? How often has that happened? I can guarantee you when you've asked that question, 9 times out of 10, the response that you've gotten is what I said, which is, fine, things are good. Right? So you're asking this general and broad question. What if instead you were to ask something a little more specific? What if you were to say, what's one thing we could have done better at that board meeting? During the last all-staff meeting that we had, did you notice anything that could have been better? So all of a sudden, centering the question around something incredibly specific, being it an event, a project, a period in time, which brings me to the second thing that you can do to help ask more specific questions, which is something of what I call time boxing a question. So instead of just saying, what's one thing we could have done better, putting a frame of time around it. So saying, in the past 2 weeks, in the past quarter, yesterday, what's one thing we could have done better? It's amazing with the CEOs that we've worked with through Know Your Company, when they start to ask more pointed and specific questions, how that unlocks feedback that they never would have gotten otherwise. As an example, let's say someone asks, like I was saying, how's it going? They're probably going to get a really shallow, not that in-depth response. Versus if they admit and they say, you know what, I've been wrestling with some big picture stuff. What's one thing in the past week we could have done better? A specific question. All of a sudden you're unlocking this insight that someone would not have shared with you otherwise just because you've prompted them to do so. So specific questions are going to get you specific answers. And that's what you want. If you're trying to get the best information possible of what's unsaid, you want to be able to ask those specific questions. So that's the second thing that each of you can do. The third thing is that you can do something. So this also seems pretty intuitive, but it's amazing how often we forget when we're listening to someone tell us, something they'd like to see change, something that they'd like to see different. It's sometimes difficult to, reframe it as not just, this person's complaining, or, man, I've heard this so many times. We have to remind ourselves that the reason this person is speaking up, is giving us this feedback, is because they want something to be done with it in the first place. And if you remember what the greatest obstacle is to being able to uncover the things unsaid, it's that sense of futility. So how you combat that is you do something about it. And what I mean by that is not just implementing every single suggestion that an employee or your teammate might have, right? Some people have bad ideas and you shouldn't implement everything. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that you can show gratitude for that person giving you that piece of feedback. You can say, you know what, I really appreciate you sharing that. And even though we can't act on it right now, even though I don't agree, it means a lot to me that you were able to bring that. Another thing you can do in terms of taking immediate action is you can explain straight up why you're not doing something. You don't have to sugarcoat or pretend or make up anything. You can just say, we don't have that in our budget, or I just don't think that's a good idea, and here's why. But explaining something instead of just assuming that this person's sentiment is just going to slowly go away, it doesn't happen. And so what you want to do in order to encourage people to speak up, to be more open, to be more honest, is for you on your end to explain, here's why we are doing things a certain way, here's why we're not doing and acting on these things. And then lastly, the most powerful thing you can do is if you do hear a suggestion that is worth being implemented, worth being acted on, no matter how small it is, knocking it out and getting that quick win, it does wonders for the momentum of employee morale in your company. And so something as small as, for example, we have a Know Your Company customer and they changed their phone service in their company. Something so small, they've been talking about it for a while, it was an insight that they'd learned through the software. But they changed their phone service, and their CEO, he emailed me and he says, Claire, you wouldn't believe how over the moon people are in the office. It's incredible. I had no idea. I'm the hero right now. And it's really interesting how just simply showing people that you're listening by just acting on something, the difference that makes. So doing something, that's possibly the most important piece of what you can do to uncover those things unspoken. So, like I was saying, the 3 things that each of you can do is you can go first, ask specific questions, and do something. And that's really how you're able to uncover what's unsaid in your company. There's a few last tips, though, that I want to share with you. One of them is, or one question that I actually get a lot from people is they'll ask me, well, Claire, how do you even open up a conversation of trying to figure out where someone's at, where my employee is at, how do I even start that conversation? One thing that works really well is asking for permission. So instead of just springing on someone and saying, hey, this is what I thought about, how you performed at last week's sales call, or hey, I would love to get your thoughts on, the project we just shipped last week, you ask for permission. Say, hey, do you have 10 minutes next week or tomorrow to sit down and I've got some thoughts of something that we could ask? Or do you mind if we sit down and I could actually give you some feedback? Would you be open to that? So asking for permission, it's a really influential way to actually open up that conversation. Another thing that is really helpful as you're thinking about how to create the best environment for people to speak up and to be open is to acknowledge the constraints that are happening. And what I mean by this is a lot of times people are really worried about the fact that feedback can get taken very personally. And I hear you, it happens, it's natural, right? Is that the things that we are talking about, the work, we all of a sudden, feel like, man, it feels like a personal attack, right? So the way that you deflect that and the way that you reframe the conversation and so it's less about the person and more about the work itself is you acknowledge the constraints. For example, if there is an employee who you can't give a raise to and you're trying to figure out the best way to frame that conversation, is just to acknowledge what the constraints are. Maybe it's not their performance, but it's what the company needs. You're talking all of a sudden about the needs of the company, where their market's at. Again, it's talking about the constraints around the situation versus a singular, very pointed comment about the person themselves. And so acknowledging the constraints is a powerful way to help create that open and honest environment. The other thing that you can do to help empathize and get to a place where, if you're about to have a conversation with a teammate who you really want to know the truth of what they're thinking, or let's say you're about to sit down with an employee and you really want to figure out, where their head's at, you really want to know what are the things unsaid that they're thinking, one thing that you can do to kind of get in the frame of mind of where they might be coming from is to ask yourself, what does it feel like to work for me? Or if you're their teammate, what does it feel like to work with me? Putting yourself in the other person's position and understanding, what perceptions or attitudes might they have about, the way communication has gone in the past can really inform the way that you're now going to talk to them going forward. So I get that all of this, it's easy to throw up on slides, right, and tell all of you, but in practice, it's hard. And I get that. I mean, it's, what I talk about for a living, and I still personally find it challenging to always be talking about the things that are unsaid. And I get it. A lot of the things that we kind of think in our heads or often hold back, they kind of feel, icky, or maybe you're like, that's really negative, or I just shouldn't say that at all. And, there's this saying of some things are better left unsaid. Is that true? I would say, okay, well maybe. There are probably some things you should keep to yourself, and I don't even want to know what those things are. But as a whole, I guarantee you that no, some things are not better left unsaid. Because the fact of the matter is that whatever is unsaid, it's still going to exist, even if you choose not to address it, not to seek it out. It's still going to be there. It's still going to affect the employee's morale. It's still going to bubble up at some point later down the line. But the things that are unsaid, they're still going to exist, whether or not you choose to do anything about them. So the whole point of this and why I stress this is that it is crucial then for you to want to know what these things unsaid are, so that you can actually take steps to solve them. Another thing that, I'm sure a lot of you might be thinking is, well, again, a lot of that, it sounds nice, it looks good on slides, but man, I've got a lot of other things to do. I've got to execute on what I need to do to make sure my business is successful on a day-to-day, and when my head's down in the day-to-day, it's, when can I have time to even think about, going first, asking specific questions, and, the way that I'm going to implement certain pieces of feedback, right? It's a lot, and I get that. I couldn't empathize more with that feeling of being overwhelmed with things to do. But what I'd also say to you is that people, they're what come first in your company. They're what make up your company. Without people, you don't have a company. So thinking deliberately about how the people in your company are feeling, how they communicate, that's how you actually win, right? That's actually how you make your product better. It's people who are working on your product. So if you really care about making sure you have the right outcomes, making sure you're winning, making sure your business is sustainable and successful, you have to think about your people first. They're the ones doing the work. And it starts with you. You know, this idea that a company culture is just something that, you know, someone else is going to take care of. It's like, you are a person in your company. You make up that culture. It's on you to take that step and to help influence the way you do things, the way you communicate, and how people are going to feel in the company. And it doesn't matter if you are an employee who's been hired 2 weeks ago or if you're the CEO. And so there's one last thing that I'll mention, which is, with all of these things, they might seem helpful, they might seem useful, but at the end of the day, none of these, ideas and thoughts I've shared with you are really that useful if they're not acted upon. And so what I challenge each of you to do, when you go into work on Monday or later in the week, is to think about, how, as a manager and a business owner, am I going first, asking specific questions and acting on things maybe I should have been acting on a few weeks ago? How, as an employee, am I making sure that the teammates that I'm working with are feeling as though they can come to me with suggestions and ideas for what could be better? And, in either situation, remembering these three things: going first, asking specific questions, and being able to do something about the feedback that you get. And lastly, what I'll say is that, I'm really here to help all of you, and that's, why I wanted to do this talk and share all this information with all of you. But if you feel as though, as a manager, this is something that's important to me, come talk to me. I'd love to talk about how in your specific company and whatever specific challenges that you're facing in terms of growth, that you can make sure that your people feel as though they can speak openly and honestly. If you're an employee and you're wondering, how do I create this sort of culture just as an employee, I'd love to talk with you and talk about what good first steps that you can actually take. And then lastly, if you're interested in actually having technology be a way to help make a lot of this happen, I'd be happy to talk to you about Know Your Company, the software that we have, how we've helped other people, and show you a demo of it. In fact, we never do discounts really ever, but something I wanted to offer the audience is, if you did end up wanting to sign up with us and use our product, is just mention Big Omaha and we'd be happy to give you 5 employee accounts for free. And so the whole idea, though, being is that, I'm here to help. Feel free to, find me on Twitter, reach out to me via email, and hopefully, what I had to say can help you uncover the things unsaid. Thank you. Y'all are so nice, by the way. People told me about this, but you're all very nice. Questions, though. Happy to answer questions. Hi.
Hi, Claire. My name is Mike Hennings, and I work at a small startup here in Omaha.
Awesome.
And I really appreciate your talk, and it's really important to me to create an empathic environment in our office. My question is, we have an open office environment, and I've noticed that changes the dynamic between conversations that can happen in front of people and ones that can't. And so how do people implement that in an open office environment versus a traditional office?
Do you mean open office environment, physical space-wise? Is that
physical
what you meant?
space.
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. How many employees do you have, the company?
Yeah, there's 8 in our office.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I've noticed that's been really successful in the companies that we work with is setting aside specific time to actually, talk about whatever it is that are, the things that are unsaid. Some companies will even set aside a time and call it, like shit talk hour or whatever, but actually, and again, everyone has their own way. But the whole idea being that when, especially in an open office environment where you feel like you can just kind of come up and tap someone on the shoulder and you're like, oh yeah, we're communicating great. Like I sit next to Bob, I see him every day. Like what is there not unsaid, right? And so scheduling that time, I think, is really important. I think another thing, especially even in an 8-person company, but finding the time to get together one-on-one is really useful. There's nothing that replaces a one-on-one conversation outside of the building. There's nothing that replaces just looking someone in the eyes and being like, hey, like that project we did last week really did not go well. Like what could I have done better, right? So those two things I would say is setting aside the time as a whole company and then also setting aside the time one-on-one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, my name is Brett, and as a manager and owner, we always try and build an environment where people feel comfortable coming forward with questions, concerns, whatever it might be. But the problem of fear and futility
Yes.
from the employee's perspective, do you have any advice for an employee who might be struggling or who wants to come forward with a concern but doesn't really know how to go about it?
Yeah. I think going first is probably one of the best ways to deflect that. So I was actually talking with a CEO just the other day who was really concerned about how to get one of their sales reps to give some feedback to talk about the company without damaging his morale. And the way that he did it is by asking for this person's advice. So instead of saying something like, hey, you've been really quiet, I just really, really want to know what you think. That oftentimes puts a lot of pressure on the person to be like, yeah, I have been quiet, but I like being quiet. Why are you trying to, know all these things? But is instead to kind of deflect it back to yourself and say, hey, we are changing the way that we're doing accountability in the entire sales team. I would love to figure out a great structure. What would you do, what would you, I would love to get your advice on what you think, would be successful for us to restructure that program. So, again, asking for advice, admitting that there's something that, the person's struggling, or that you're struggling with. The other thing, too, is to actually, especially if you think futility is a real barrier, is to talk about it. Because oftentimes, a lot of employees will carry with them from previous job experiences that feeling of futility. For instance, maybe in your company, you've actually implemented a lot of suggestions, and so it's like, I don't understand why people would feel that sense of futility. But people carry it from previous experiences. So talking about that and saying, hey, like I know maybe at other jobs, you might have seen a lot of talk and no action, but I'm really, open and willing to hear, I can take anything. That's always seemed to work well. Hope that answers your question. Great, thanks.
I'm the person at the bottom of the totem pole, and so I have a question kind of going from that.
Yes.
I mean, this all works really well in a top-down,
Yes.
but how does it work bottoms-up? I mean,
Yes.
what do I need to say to my manager to not be in a defensive mode, or
Yes.
could you give a few
Yes.
things to say?
Such a good question, and that's really what kind of spurred my whole passion. I can relate to that so well. I didn't know how to do that at the time. But what is most effective for, one, making sure that if you're giving feedback upwards, that the person doesn't get defensive, is reminding the person of the intention behind why you're giving that piece of feedback, right? And so if you feel like, for instance, communication has been really clogged in the company, is not to be like, you know what, I think you as a leader have been clogging, making communication really not transparent, but instead to say, hey, when I joined this company, one of the things that I really cared about was transparency, and it's what I was really excited about. I would love to figure out if there are ways to make sure we can continue to do that, right? What manager, wouldn't agree that they would want that goal and that outcome? So reminding whoever you're giving that feedback to upward what the intention is, why you're really giving it, that's always a key thing to do. Awesome.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm actually a student in high school right now,
Nice.
and I've noticed that there's sort of a similar power dynamic in the classroom.
Yes.
And I was wondering if maybe the same principles you talk about here that apply to companies, maybe those might be able to apply to like a classroom.
Yes.
Like the large majority of students aren't getting something because a teacher isn't quite explaining it right.
Yes. That's such an important parallel. There was actually a CEO who also teaches at a university, and he was like, yeah, I feel like the same thing happens in the classroom. I feel like my students aren't as honest as they could be. It's tough in a school environment because honestly, a lot of the incentives that are structured, whether it's around grades or the way that teachers are evaluated, can skew and mess with a lot of, why people don't want to say something or do want to say something. But I would say, yeah, as a student, I think it's actually similar to, a company situation where you would really want to communicate to the teacher, hey, here's what I really want to get out of the class, here's why I signed up for it, here's what I'm really excited about, here's what I love about your class, I want more of that. Or here are some ideas that I had so that we could do more of that. Figuring out what's the thing that my teacher and then I, or my manager and I, can both agree on, and emphasizing that. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Kind of to build on what he said before, I think that the philosophies you're talking about are very transportable. So you talked about small organizations who you serve,
Yes.
but a large organization is really just made up of sub-organizations.
Yes.
And so if you lead a sub-organization within a large organization, how can you create this kind of culture collectively with other leaders? And I work at the University of Nebraska, so I'm kind of thinking of that application.
That's a fantastic question. So I've always been, and this is just a personal belief, one person's grain of, thought, but I've always personally believed the best way to convince someone that something's working is just to show them, right? And so if you can kind of show, and it's almost like you're selling the culture, right, to your fellow leaders. But if you can show them the before situation and then the after scenario of, hey, here are the things that we did. We did regular one-on-ones. We set aside a weekly time. These are the questions that we asked, and here are the results. Here are the things that we've changed in our department. Here are the anecdotes that I've heard from my employees. Showing people rather than saying, hey guys, this is important. Aren't you on board? Aren't you on board? Right? Showing people, I always feel like, is the best way to make sure that you get their buy-in as well. Cool. Thanks so much, everyone.